I'm going to today give a talk that's not predominantly about technology, but more about how we incorporate technology into our society. Obviously, we'll mention technology because it's a big part of the equation here, but it's just one component, I think, of a bigger picture that I'd like to discuss. So, you know, I've been involved with some open source projects, Lucene, which is reasonably well known, and Hadoop as well. You know, I started these to serve needs that I had, and they've since been found to be useful in many more places than I ever imagined. You know, it's really not by my design, but I was fortunate to be an instigator of what's turning out to be a revolution in data processing, a new style of managing data and processing it. We're now, based around Hadoop, we're seeing this new style where we're using commodity hardware, no longer expensive, exotic hardware, with open source software to build systems that scale with automated reliability at the software layer, so that you can use inexpensive hardware, and also a different way of using the data. The style in Hadoop systems is to load the data in its natural format that it's generated in as much as possible, and store it and save it. We've had this phenomenal revolution in hardware that's given us these tremendous computing resources, the ability to store things, and now we have technology in Hadoop that lets us actually take advantage of that affordable hardware to store nearly everything. And then we can process it very flexibly using tools. We started out with MapReduce, with batch processing in Java, and have moved beyond that to supporting SQL, both batch SQL with systems like Hive, as well as interactive SQL, systems like Impala, and search, machine learning with tools like Spark, in-memory processing, streaming, and on and on. We've seen this turn into a general purpose platform that lets folks evolve applications rather than have to design them up front. It's a different way of building them than they were earlier doing. And to share data between different applications rather than have data siloed. And with this new platform, we're really seeing adoption across industries. I mean, I started out doing this to support search, my particular area of expertise. But it's been adopted in the last several years, you know, first by web companies doing analytics of their logs, of their traffic, trying to predict which ad would be the best ad to show someone, to now many other industries, nearly every industry. I've seen folks in transportation using this, study traffic patterns, in heavy equipment to look at doing predictive maintenance on machinery that's in the field, in utilities, monitoring people's energy consumption and trying to balance it, the load effectively, as well as make people aware of their energy use. And on, healthcare, banking, just it's tremendous variety. Again, it's this general purpose platform that has proven useful because of its affordable, scalable, flexible nature, to the point where it's really becoming the new default way that folks are building applications. You know, in the past decades, relational database was the mainstay of corporate data processing. And relational methods aren't gone. They're not going away. But now they're being augmented by a suite of other tools and even made more flexible, where you can interoperate between real-time processing, between relational queries, between full-text queries, between machine learning, and have all these things together at a far smaller cost with far greater amounts of data. So, we all hear about this, the big data revolution, which is underway. And now I think we've seen in Hadoop and the ecosystem around it, this enterprise data hub, which is becoming the new default platform for enterprise data. And we need to start thinking about what's next. Now that the end of the revolution is in sight, how are we going to govern this new, what will become the new normal mode of operation? And it is different. We are now able to gather much more data and make use of it. And we will be able to, henceforth. And I think we're at a really critical juncture here, where the ways that we manage this transition will be with us for a century. These sorts of technological transitions don't happen every day. And so we need to think our way through it carefully. You hear a lot about the hazards of this technology as well as the benefits. And I think we can have both. Sorry, I should say that. I think we can avoid the hazards and have the benefits if we are careful and conscious about how we approach this. Nearly every science fiction film and novel I read these days, the guys who collect data are the bad guys. That's become the standard in fiction these days. And I hope that's not the case. I hope that's not the future that we're looking forward to. We've had some examples of states and private actors doing unfortunate things with data, which I hope we won't overreact to. We need to understand what limits to draw here. We want to be really especially careful, not though to prevent the benefits. As the population grows, as our world changes, we need technology to help us in many areas. There's still, not everyone in the world is living a happy, healthy life, and anything we can do to improve people's lives, we ought to do. We ought not to prevent. So a couple examples of areas that I think data can really have a good advantage if we do things right, or we might limit ourselves if not, are for example, education. As we adopt technology, as the world advances, and we benefit from a greater and greater degree of education. It's been shown again and again that the more educated people are, the better they fare economically. So this is in society's interest, that we have effective educational systems. It's been shown that different children learn at different rates in different areas, that moving everyone along in lockstep through a curriculum is not the most effective way to educate. We want to make our education efficient, obviously. As we move forward, as we advance, our educational systems need to keep improving in pace with everything else we do, or else everything else will be dragged down. So the way that we can improve education, the way we can figure out how to pace things, can better understand what works and what doesn't, is to collect data about how kids are learning. And this frightens people, as it should. We ought to be cautious about collecting data about children. We ought to be very cautious and develop systems that we can trust. And I'm going to talk a little more later about some guidelines I think we might use. First, a couple more examples. Healthcare, another one. You know, people ought not to suffer needlessly. We've made a lot of advances in healthcare, but there's many more to be made. And again, these very much depend on having information about people's private, about their bodies. Very personal stuff needs to be collected en masse and understood. Now, not everyone needs to see it, obviously. It needs to be only seen by the folks who are doing the research. But it might need to be shared. So we need to set up the right mechanisms, again, so that we can trust the people who've collected this with our data. Another example is climate change. I think probably the largest challenge facing us as a society in the next century, which we're not yet doing a very effective job of managing. And there's lots of ways here, too, that data can play. I mentioned earlier utilities. If we can better understand how people use energy, how people use transportation systems, we can optimize those systems and minimize the amount of energy they use. But again, in many cases, this might contain personal data. Another lesson that I think we can draw that's interesting from climate change is the history of the CO2 measurement. This data was originally collected not to measure climate change. Climate change wasn't known to be occurring when they started sampling the CO2 levels around the globe. They were studying other things, and in that process discovered climate change. And so the message I think we can get from that is that it's hard to determine up front what utility data will have. And so I think trying to restrict collection to, at the time of collection, data that you know how to use already is short-sighted. We need to over-collect and then regulate against harm. So I'm going to go into that a little more detail here, because I think we need to build this trust. That's a fundamental thing. People need to trust that their data is not being abused. Some people think this is a problem that technology can solve. Technology plays a role here, but I don't think it's the only element. We can anonymize data, and we ought to when that's appropriate. We can encrypt data, and we ought to, but these things aren't foolproof. There are many examples where people have published supposedly anonymized databases, and people have been able to work out who the people are in them, though they weren't supposed to. And so we can't rely on anonymization. Same with encryption. We find bugs in encryption systems all the time. We ought to use encryption whenever we can, because it can stop a lot of things, but we can't assume that it stops everything. We can't trust it as a backstop. I think we really need policies. In some ways we can't completely stop crime, but we have laws and we have systems to manage crime and minimize it. And I think similarly, we need to adopt the right regulations around data. And I think the most fundamental element is transparency. If people need to know, they deserve to know what data has been collected about them and how it's being used. If the use changes over time, that needs to be well documented. Tim Berners-Lee this morning talked about that the importance of telling people if you start to do something new with their data. And I think this is really critical. It gives us a leg to stand on in order to decide whether we think usages are appropriate or not. The first thing we need to know is what's being done. It needs to be a requirement of any system that collects data. People don't want to be surprised later. I think that's what's actually led to a lot of scandals about government data collection, was the surprise. People didn't realize the data that was being collected. and they resent that they weren't told and didn't have an opportunity to intercede earlier, and moreover how it was being used. And so we need to make sure that this is done up front. It needs to be required. Another element is to develop best practices for how private data is managed. It ought to be encrypted. We ought to support encryption across our tools. The way that encryption is managed is important. We shouldn't necessarily have the people who are managing our hardware also manage our encryption keys and our authentication and authorization. We can split these functions and make it much harder for there to be breaches. Again, we're not going to make it impossible. We're going to make it awkward. We don't want to have folks tempted. When we display data, if something isn't germane to the use, it shouldn't be displayed. If you have images of people, you don't need to show their face. It doesn't mean you need to erase their face from the data permanently. It just means you need to not display it unless someone is perhaps a dermatologist who needs to see the skin on the cheek or something. And you also need to, as a part of this, keep track of what's been done. You need to keep enough, keep records sufficient to reconstruct who's done what, who's seen what, so that you can verify that best practices have been followed. Audit is incredibly important. We can't blindly trust. We need to be able to trust with enforcement. And we also need to define what do we not want to happen. In many cases, this is already covered by existing laws around privacy, and we need to just enforce those in the new domain. For example, lending practices. It's already forbidden to discriminate on the basis of race. It's very easy to come up with machine learning algorithms which might inadvertently discriminate on race, and we need to make sure that we don't. So that the existing laws we need to learn how to interpret in the new space. But moreover, there's new things that are now possible which we didn't imagine earlier. You can match, perhaps using public data, someone's face to their phone number or home address. That's not a good idea to have that as a public service. And if it's not already illegal, it ought to be. And so our laws need to carefully define what we don't want to happen. And I think this is the right direction. Tim Berners-Lee also, I think, indicated that he agrees with this principle, that it's again not so much about what's collected, but how it's used. That's what we really need to focus on and make sure that people are not abusing our privacy. Lastly, we need to have oversight in order to build this confidence. If we want people to tell us what they're going to do with our data, we also want to verify that that's actually what they're doing. We have this in many industries already. We have oversight in banking and in stock markets. We don't blindly trust the people in these sorts of financial situations. There are government and non-government industry consortiums that monitor every transaction and make sure that folks are following the laws, aren't trading illegally. Similarly, we need to have the same thing here. We need to have as a best practice that we record everything that happens, and we need to have independent monitoring to ensure that folks are obeying. And if they're not, there needs to be punishments, and we need to institute these. It's a big problem. It's not specific to any country. Our legal system has trouble grappling with this. We've seen recently this right to be forgotten case in Spain that has repercussions across Europe, and how search engine results are displayed. And the question is, should it have repercussions across the globe? And we're wrestling with these issues. There is progress. In the US, the FTC, I think, is doing a lot of wonderful work in this area. And Europe is in the process of enacting this GDPR, which I'm fascinated to watch this go through, and optimistic that it will be reasonable. And anyway, I encourage all of you to get involved in this as well. It's our duty if we want the industries that we're a part of to thrive. We don't want big data to be like the Manhattan Project, to be perceived as a mistake. We don't want to regret where we've gone. We want to be proud of how this technology can be used. And I believe we can. I think it's well within our grasp if we think carefully about the policies that we enact in the coming years. That's all I have. I think we have a few minutes for questions. I'm happy to talk about these issues, or if folks like, we could talk about Hadoop and other big data issues. I don't know if there's a microphone for questions, or I can just repeat the question.
Hi, I work in healthcare. I do data analytics, and my clients give me access to certain cancer data sets or diabetes data sets, and we use them to do predictive modeling on those patients. I'm wondering if you know of any other larger public available data sets that I can use to add into that to talk about other things to get larger sort of population correlations.
The question is, a gentleman works in healthcare and has access to some data sets about cancer, I believe, and diabetes, and is wondering if I know of other data sets that are publicly available. And I don't, and I think it's a problem with, is publicly distributing these. I think there are informal networks of sharing between researchers, but I think it's not well understood either by the researchers or by the patients what is shareable. So no, I'm not sure of any repository. I think people would probably be very careful not to advertise it, and rather they're doing it quietly, sort of behind closed doors, in the way that physicians used to do autopsies in secret, and and we need to come out from behind the curtains, I think, more about this stuff. Yeah. Question is, should data subjects be able to opt out of being aggregated when their data flows upstream? Again, I think it comes back to how the aggregated data is used. I think aggregation in itself is essential in many cases. I think opting out after the fact can be hard to impossible, depending on how the data is aggregated, and so it's not really practical. I think it would. That's an example of something which could actually do a lot of harm.
So when you're collecting data, you should disclose exactly what's going to be done with the data?
Yes, so the question is, should you disclose what's going to be done with the data when you collect it? Yeah. Definitely, you should disclose everything you know. But I think the hard part about that is you may not know everything at the time you collect it. And there needs to be mechanisms to subsequently say, now we're going to do this, and for people to pay attention to it. And it needs to not be buried in legalese somewhere. I think that's another reason for the need for audits and for organizations that are out there helping us build this trust in institutions.
Yeah. You used the term define abuses, but you didn't say anything define oversight and define transparency and define best practices. Do we have to do that as well?
Yes, I think we need to do all of those. I mean, I think these are. I'm trying to prod people a little. I think these are the general principles. I'm not an attorney, so I can't actually write write these things out specifically. I don't know if you have something in mind.
No, I just think we all have a different opinion about what these words mean.
I see. You think transparency means something different than, transparency to me means being public about one's policies and one's practices, not necessarily about publishing all of one's data. That's what I mean by transparency, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, Thank you. I'm working with emergency data after disasters and earthquakes. Do you think we can disclose the data after a disaster to make a data and public analysis?
What kind of data did you say you're working with?
I'm sorry, I'm doing disaster, like an
Disaster
earthquake.
data.
Yeah. I'm trying to apply this data analysis in disasters.
It's hard to know. I mean, it depends on what sort of data you're collecting, whether people will be upset if you publish it. It's without a lot more information, I'm not going to give you my opinion, and it's not my opinion alone that matters.
Hello, thanks for the session, Doug. I wondered if you could just give us your take on the current value or otherwise of the enterprise distributions of Hadoop and the ingestion of proprietary software into an open source movement. Distributions I think are essential. Folks don't want to install each of the open source products on their own any more than they want to build a Linux kernel and then install all the other components of Linux. So they're filling that role. About the proprietary, I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at. So Cloudera's distribution, for example, is entirely open source. The platform, we do have some tools on top which are proprietary for management, but they're not part of the runtime. We predominantly invest in the open source platform in order to have a viable business that will survive and that customers can depend on for the long term. We need to have some proprietary software just to justify a particular business model. We think that there aren't viable businesses that are based on support alone, and so what happens in that case is you end up with a company that gets acquired, and then you've got somebody who has some sort of loss leader that they're using to promote some other technology, the acquirer's proprietary technology. I think that's the risk of a service only. Service only open source companies have never prevailed, have never succeeded, and so having a small element of proprietary software at the top, I think, permits us to build a viable business. I think over the long term, our aim is that we'll constantly add new proprietary layers on the top and open source things beneath that. We only want a small proprietary veneer that really helps us serve our customers. The current proprietary software really is the integrated support solution. So it's part of, if you're a customer and you're getting support, then you need this layer to help us better support you, if that makes sense. We're not trying to, I don't think it infects the entire platform very much. It's a clean layer on top.
Yeah, in regards to trust, opt-in, opt-out, it used to be, as I was growing up, the opt-in model, where you automatically opted in, is the realm of scam. Today, as growing up, opting in, opting out, trust, and big data. On the one hand, I'm in favor of big data. I'm in favor of using aggregated small amounts of data for health and all that sort of stuff. But when you look around at data being collected, perhaps more so when you sign up stuff, you download software, more than often now, instead of tick this if you want it, it's tick this if you don't want it, but I'm pre-ticking it for you and I'm pre-ticking these other things. To me, people aren't having trust broken because they're not seeing it. But ultimately, that is breaking any kind of trust you have in how you're going to use that software. What do you think, any chance of us moving back to where things are and you want to opt in, tick it?
It's not, frankly, an issue that I worry about a lot. I mean, it's a fine grain. Oops, I'm out of time here. I really think fundamentally you need to have. There's things that you're not opting into, which are probably legal to collect, which you're not aware that are being collected already. So I think the problem is more fundamental, and we need to just make sure that even those passive things, cameras on the street, et cetera, sensors on the road, are not being abused. And we need to be comfortable with that and be able to feel as though that's something we can trust. And I don't think we're there yet, and I'm not convinced that that if we have a world littered with click boxes, that alone will stop abuse. Right. I think it's a tricky thing to legislate, opt-in versus opt-out. Depends on the wording, and there's probably a lot of subtlety. People can move negation around easily in language. I don't see that as a major component, in my opinion. But thank you again all for coming. Hope to see you around later today.